All right, welcome back to the Bits of Good Bootcamp. What we're going to talk about next is something called JSX. And let's get into that so you figure out what that is. And if you look here at the bottom, let's actually start there. You can see that JSX is kind of confusing. It looks a little bit like JavaScript. We have const element equal sign, but then this part here, well, that looks a lot like HTML. And so it's a little bit confusing what exactly is going on. And the answer really is that it's a blend of both HTML and JavaScript. And what it really is it's like the templating language that React uses. And what it ends up doing is it ends up producing React elements. And so again, I decided to dive into the docs to figure out, well, why did the developers of React decide to introduce JSX? And straight from the horse's mouth, here's the answer. React embraces the fact that rendering logic is inherently coupled with other UI logic, how events are handled, how the state changes over time, and how data is prepared for display. And for that reason, they decided that in a templating language, you needed both JavaScript and HTML to be able to handle the intricacies of that situation. And it's also important to note, actually, that you technically can write React without using JSX. It's not required. But with that being said, I couldn't imagine taking on a project in React without using JSX. It's just definitely the way to go. So even though it's not required, just about everybody does it. Okay, so let's start getting into more of how JSX is used. And what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about embedding expressions into JSX. So if you look here, I have a variable. So this is just regular JavaScript, right? And this is just a variable name with Josh Perez. And then I have a React element here, and so we'll get into a little bit more what React elements are later, but for now, just suffice it to say that it's a React element. And you can see actually that inside of this HTML looking thing, I have a curly brace and I have name, which is the JavaScript variable. And so you might be wondering to yourself, well, what's happening here? And the answer is that what JSX is going to do is essentially replace the value of name, in this case, Josh Perez, inside of here. And then, so when the element is actually, like if you were to look at what the element is, it will actually say h1, hello, Josh Perez, close h1. So it's kind of interpolating the value of name into this expression. And then here, again, there's this kind of magical thing we haven't talked much about that seems to be doing some kind of rendering action with an element and something with a root. But we'll talk about that more later. The important thing to note is that you can embed any valid JavaScript expression inside of a curly bracket like this in JSX. And actually, it goes further than just being able to embed variables. You can actually call functions inside this. So this function is going to be executed, right? We're passing in format name, and we're passing in this user here. And so it's actually going to print out Harper Perez, right? With a space in between. So that will be what this is evaluated to inside of the JavaScript or inside of the JSX. So this is obviously a very powerful tool because it allows us to execute JavaScript inside the formation of our HTML. That should be alarm bells going off in your head about how powerful that is. All right, so now it's important to realize that JSX in and of itself is actually an expression as well. So a line of JSX is actually evaluated to something, which makes sense because here we've always been returning JSX and saving it to an element. So right now I'm just explicitly telling you that in fact JSX does return something. It is an expression. And here we have a function that is creating a greeting essentially depending on whether or not a user parameter is passed in. And so what this function is going to do is it's going to return JSX. And this is one example of the power that JSX allows us to uncover because it is an expression. So you can actually use JSX like inside of if statements, like here we're using it inside of an if statement. It could be used inside of a loop. You could use a loop to like iteratively build a JSX thing if you wanted to like concatenate a lot of things together. You can assign variables to be equal to JSX as we've done before. We can pass in JSX as a parameter. And again here in this example, it can also be returned from a function. So it's treated almost just like a JavaScript variable, except it's special. It's JSX. Okay, so there's also some specific notation kind of syntax things to note with JSX. The first thing is that all HTML attributes are using camel case instead of dashes. So normally, for example, if you were using an HTML attribute tab index, for example, it would actually be tab dash index, and that's how you would create a div with tab index with a value of 0. But in React, we actually use camel case, and you can just kind of convince yourself it's because JSX is a blend of JSX and HTML, but it's a little bit more similar to JavaScript. They decided to use camel case for these kind of things. And another really important thing, and this will definitely trip you up if you don't pay attention, instead of using class as an attribute to apply a CSS class, so think here div class, say button or something, you actually use class name. And that's just a small change that JSX makes, because otherwise this class attribute will clash with the ES6 classes that we can actually talk more about later. But enough. So here you can see that we're using string literals to pass in a value for an attribute. And then just like before, we can actually use curly brackets to evaluate some JavaScript and assign that to the attribute. So here, tab index is just assigned to a literal string, and here in source, the user avatar URL is going to be evaluated, and whatever that returns is what is going to be assigned to source. The really important thing to note is that you should never use both quotes and curly braces. It's really just one or the other, depending on if you want to explicitly set the value, use the quotes, or if you want the value to be evaluated from some JavaScript expression, then you use curly braces. So this is really powerful. Curly braces are how we set things dynamically. Quotes is how we set things statically. Okay, now another question that you might have is, well, can I put JSX inside of things? So far we've only seen things at one level, but in fact you can actually do quite a bit with JSX. The first caveat though is that you have to make sure that you close every single element. So here you see I'm closing an element. I cannot just leave this open. That will throw all kinds of errors. So I just have one succinctly closed element. It's also fair to just have another image tag with a close separately, and we've used the shorthand here. But here you can see an example where JSX tags can actually contain children. So we have a div, and then the div actually has two children inside of it, right? So this JSX element is actually consisting of 1, 2, 3 distinct HTML elements. The important thing to note here, although that you can have many children inside of a JSX element, you can only have one outermost JSX element. So if I, for example, got rid of this div here and I just had an element that was H1 and H2, this would return an error. This is not Gucci, but it's okay because I have a div wrapping around it in this case. Okay. Now, it's also really important to note that JSX takes some measures to protect us from injection attacks. The React DOM escapes any values embedded in JSX before rendering them, and so this helps us prevent cross-site scripting. And so here you can see this example where we have title being equal to something that maybe the user sends us, which we don't know what it is. Like the user could send us anything, so it could be potentially malicious. But because JSX escapes everything, it's safe to just go ahead and use that inside the JSX without having to do any kind of cleaning of that beforehand. Okay, and then we also see here that JSX actually represents objects. So here, this is the JSX that we've been seeing in the last couple slides and you're coming to love already. You can also see this as an example here where we're using class name instead of just regular class. But here, this is actually equivalent to roughly this. And this is just a call here to the React API directly as opposed to using JSX to create an element. But these things will actually return the same thing. So you can see this is the type of HTML tag, any attributes associated with it, and then the contents. And likewise here, type of HTML tag, attributes, and then the content. And what this actually looks like in object form would be like this. And it's granted a little bit simplified, but more or less this is what you can imagine that the React create element or JSX is going to finally be compiled down to before it's actually rendered by React on the DOM. And you should probably be asking yourself, okay, well, what is the magic that goes on that allows this to be translated to this and then finally look like this? And the answer to that is Babel. Babel is what we're using for transcribing the JSX into regular JavaScript. And we're not really going to get too far into this because this kind of opens up a whole can of worms. But just suffice it to say that Babel is a necessary intermediate step between evaluating our JSX code and then actually having runnable JavaScript that our browsers can show to our users. All right, that's it for this video. Thanks.